Chapter 16:21. Chi and Anlin left first, leaving Yu Lianxiu alone. Linda came in carefully. Seeing that Mr. Ye's hair was a little messy, Linda's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if Mr. Yu was hurt or not. Yu Lianxiu's voice was very calm. "Wait for me outside." Linda nodded and left. After she left, Yu Lianxiu lowered his head and examined himself. She admitted that she had seduced Qin Anlin today. It wasn't because she wanted to have sex with him, but because she wanted to keep his heart. In the long years to come, she didn't know if he would be angry at her like he used to be. She wasn't afraid. She looked down, smiled, and slowly walked out. Because she was lonely, she deliberately didn't think about her birthday. On her 28th birthday, she worked overtime in the company until 8 o'clock. When she left, the road was still full of Xiao Mian's billboards. Her phone rang. She stopped in front of a red light and took a look. It was a video message from Pei Chi. Pei Chi and Tang Yu were on vacation in France, but she still remembered her birthday and sent a video message to congratulate her. "Liangxiu, I'll bring you the gift when I come back." Pei Chi smiled sweetly. Behind her was the night view of Paris. Yu Liangxiu's eyes softened, and she silently said, "Thank you." She didn't go home directly. She had already fallen asleep. Her phone rang again, and it was Jie. "Liangxiu, do you have time to come out for dinner? I just got off work." Jie sounded a little tired. Yu Liangxiu nodded. "Okay, I'll see you in half an hour." After hanging up, she turned the car around. When she arrived half an hour later, Jie was already there. She sat by the window and waited. When she saw Yu Liangxiu, she waved at her. "Liangxiu." Yu Liangxiu sat down. "I didn't know if you were free, so I called you at the last minute." Jie smiled faintly. Yu Liangxiu shook her head. "I'm not busy." Jie suddenly took out an exquisite box. "Birthday present." Yu Liangxiu pursed her lips and looked up. There was surprise in her eyes. Jie smiled. "No matter how old you are, you're still that 19-year-old girl." After that, he gestured for Yu Liangxiu to open the box. Inside was a crystal music box. The first movie Yu Liangxiu starred in was engraved with laser technology, and the music was the theme song. "That's great." Yu Liangxiu looked up. "Thank you, Jie." She knew that this was not cheap. It was custom-made and would cost at least 100,000. Jie smiled. "What are you thanking me for?" "As long as you're happy. Let's take advantage of today and have some fun together." Yu Liangxiu looked at her for a long time before asking softly, "Jie, have you been unhappy lately?" "Why not?" Jie smiled. "You're so silly." The waiter came over to serve the dishes. After the dishes were served, Jie started eating. "I'm already in my 40s, and there are many unhappy things. Usually, I go home alone, and there's no one to talk to. Today is your birthday, but it's more like I'm looking for someone to accompany me." After that, she drank half a glass of aperitif. The golden liquid flowed down her throat. It was a little spicy, but Jie did not even frown. Yu Liangxiu looked at her and said softly, "If you're lonely, find someone to accompany you." "I won't. If it's not the one I want, there's no point in finding someone." Jie held on to the glass and laughed softly. Chapter 16:22. Let's stop talking. Let's eat. Jie was also a straightforward person. She wouldn't be so gloomy all the time. Yu Liangxiu nodded and chatted happily, but they all skipped the topic of Qin Anlin. Although Xiao Mian was under Jie's care, her heart was always on Yu Liangxiu's side. In the end, she hesitated for a moment and said, "I know that you and President Qin haven't divorced. Look at that Xiao Mian. She's not a law-abiding person." Yu Liangxiu didn't have anything to hide in front of her. She nodded and said, "I know. There's nothing between President Qin and her." Jie sighed. "Don't be too bad to him. Understand." Yu Liangxiu smiled bitterly. "I know." Jie didn't mention it again. She wasn't a person who didn't know her limits. The two of them finished the meal in silence. At the end of the dessert, a small cake was magically given to them. "After eating the cake, it'll be your birthday." Jie smiled. Yu Liangxiu felt a little warm in her heart. She made an exception and finished a small piece. When the two of them were about to leave, after passing through the long aisle, the door of a private room on the side opened. The sound coming from inside made her whole body tense up. It was Qin Amlin's voice. Then, the person inside walked out. Not only him, but also little Mu Yun, who was holding little Moo Moo in her arms. When little Moo Moo was sent away, it was only a week old. Now it had grown up. She could tell at a glance that it was her little Moo Moo. As for Mu Yun, she hadn't seen him for almost a year. It wasn't that she didn't want to, but that she didn't dare to. The air seemed to have frozen. She looked at her children, her red lips trembling slightly, and she couldn't say a word for a long time. "Mom." Mu Yun rushed over, hugged her waist, and buried his little face in her arms. It was rare for this child to act like a spoiled child, but after not seeing her for a year, he missed his mother. Yi Lianxiu reached out and hugged her son. He had grown taller and stronger. It had been so long since she last saw him, but he was still so warm toward her. She felt extremely guilty, but she couldn't say it out loud. She reached out to rub the little fellow's hair and choked with emotion. Mu Yun. The little fellow snuggled in her arms for a long time. Suddenly, he raised his eyes and ran over to pick up little Moo Moo. He presented her to his mother and said fawningly, "This is my younger sister." He was clearly her child, but Yi Lianxiu actually felt a sense of fear. Little Moo Moo had been raised very well and could compete with Yi Lianxiu. At this time, she was also eating her fingers and blinking at Yi Lianxiu. Suddenly, little Moo Moo leaned over and kissed her. His saliva was all over her. The little fellow squeaked and laughed cheerfully. He looked like a lively child and was very similar to Momo. This was a little different from her. Perhaps Qin Amlin had been like this when he was young. Holding the little bun in her arms, Yi Lianxiu couldn't bear to put it down. Her face was pressed against little Moo Moo, and her eyes were a little warm. "I heard from Ingjia that it's your birthday." Qin Amlin's voice was indifferent. "What a coincidence." Yi Lianxiu looked up at him. Yes. A little hope rose in her heart. Did he specially ask her to meet the children on this day? Just as she was thinking about it, he interrupted her mercilessly. "Mr. Yi, don't think too much. It's just a coincidence." After saying that, he hugged little Moo Moo and kissed him. "Let's go home." Little Moo Moo lay on his shoulder and looked back at Yi Lianxiu. Little Moo Moo liked the fragrant smell on her body. Chapter 16:23. This was the child that she had given birth to. It had only been a few days, and she had sent it away. Now that she saw it, she felt very sad and bitter. She wanted Qin Amlin to put the child down and let her see it more, but her throat seemed to be blocked, and she couldn't say anything. Qin Amlin turned around and held little Moo Moo in his arms. He looked at Yi Lianxiu coldly, then lowered his head and looked at little Moo Moo. Little Moo Moo hugged his father with his chubby little hands and cried out twice. Then, he leaned softly into Qin Amlin's arms. He looked like a little white sheep and was extremely cute. Yi Lianxiu was a little envious and looked at him for a long time. Qin Amlin's face was pressed against the little sheep, and he held the little guy up with his palm. The little guy cried out softly. Yi Lianxiu looked at him, and her eyes became even hotter. To her, little Moo Moo was the best birthday present. Whether it was intentional or just a chance encounter, she was very happy. Her fingers gently touched little Moo Moo's fat calf. "Moo Moo, you have to listen to Daddy." Qin Amlin glanced at her. "I thought he didn't have a mother." He didn't move, nor did he have any intention of leaving. She paused for a long time before she realized that he wanted her to hug Moo Moo. Could she really? She carefully picked up little Moo Moo, afraid that the little guy wouldn't be willing. However, the little sheep was obedient and let her hug him. Yi Lianxiu knew that no matter how reluctant she was, she could only hug him for a while. Letting Moo Moo rely on her would only cause more harm to the child, so she returned Moo Moo to Qin Amlin after a while. Beside her, Qingxiu said indifferently, "Young master, the car is already waiting." She didn't communicate with Yi Lianxiu at all. From a moment Yi Lianxiu stood on Su Shirqing's side, she was no longer her young madam. Yi Lianxiu could naturally feel Qingxiu's attitude. She naturally felt a little sad in her heart, but she only smiled. Qin Amlin didn't stay any longer. He turned around and left, with Crispy's sleeve following behind him. "I'll steal my sister out in the future." Little Mu Yun's voice was low as he waved at Yi Lianxiu. He was only a 9-year-old child, but he was actually so sensible and experienced. Yi Lianxiu felt a little sad. She went forward to hug him and said softly, "Mommy will be with Mu Yun in the future." Little Mu Yun nodded obediently. He had been raised by Yi Lianxiu since he was young, so he trusted his mother. "I'll send you out to find your father." Yi Lianxiu turned around and nodded at Jie. Then, she personally sent little Mu Yun to the entrance of the hotel. A black Maybach was parked in front of the hotel. Qing Xiu and little Mu Mu had already gotten into the car. Qin Amlin leaned against the door, obviously waiting for little Mu Yun. In the strong night wind, he leaned against the car door and smoked quietly. Yi Lianxiu approached and opened the door for little Mu Yun to get into the car. The door closed, and she took 2 steps back. She was only 1 step away from him. Her voice was very soft. "Anyway, Amlin, thank you. I said it was a coincidence." Qin Amlin puffed out a smoke ring and said lightly. She looked at him deeply. "I'm leaving." When she turned around, her eyes were red. He walked forward step by step, using all of his strength. On a night like this, she wanted to hug him and feel his warmth. However, the only thing she could do was to leave him. Chapter 16:24. Yi Lianxiu had some misgivings at first, but after a while, she smiled and said, "Okay." Jie looked up at her boss again. Qin Amlin finished smoking the cigarette in his hand, glared at Jie, and then got into the car. When he buckled his seatbelt and started the car, Su Xiu said, "Young master, are you still not going to forgive young madam?" Qin Amlin looked ahead intently. After a long time, he said softly, "There's no such thing as forgiveness." Su Xiu didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't dare to ask anymore. There was music in the car. After a while, Su Xiu said, "This is Miss Xia's song, right? It's quite nice." Qin Amlin didn't notice it at first, but now that he paid attention, he realized that it was true. Su Xiu continued, "Miss Xia is not bad. She cares about young master and takes care of young master and young Mississippi young master. You can consider her." Qin Amlin tightened his grip on the steering wheel. After a long time, he reminded her, "Aunt Su, I'm not single. It's not a solution to keep dragging it on." Su Xiu said earnestly, "Young master can't always be single. I'm old too. In the future, someone has to take care of Mu Yun and Mu Mu. I'll take care of them myself. Don't mention this in the future." Although Qin Amlin's tone was indifferent, he was obviously unhappy. Su Xiu didn't say anything. She hugged Mu Mu and sighed. "The child is still young. You have to think more about him." Qin Amlin didn't reply. He first sent Su Xiu back to the old mansion, and then he took the 2 children back to the apartment. During the day, he sent the children to Su Xiu's place, but at night, he took care of them himself. This lasted for about half a year. It was very hard, but he stubbornly persisted. He stopped the car and asked Mu Yun to get out of the car by himself. He carried Mu Mu down. The little guy was asleep, and it was very comfortable to hold him. The chubby little ball was lying in his arms. Qin Amlin lowered his head and kissed his little daughter. His eyes were filled with gentleness. Holding his little daughter in one hand and little Mu Yun in the other, he arrived at the apartment and turned on the lights. When the lights were on, Qin Amlin's eyes fell on the sofa. It was empty, but he longed for someone to sit there, someone who would never appear. She lowered her eyes and smiled. "I'm home." Little Mu Yun carried little Mu Mu from his arms. It was quite strenuous for her to carry him. Qin Amlin went to turn on the bath water. Poor little Mu Mu was woken up by Papa and his brother. He opened his big, cute eyes, looked at the bubbles around him, and burst into tears. Little Mu Yun squatted down and helped her father bathe the little fellow. She was like a little cow, very cute, just like that little milkshake bun. Therefore, before the little yellow bun appeared, he was willing to take care of his sister. Little Mu Mu cried for a long time, but when she realized that it was useless, she looked at her papa with her big tear-filled eyes. The baby was only 6 months old. Mu Mu's hair was thin yellow. It was cute and funny. Qin Amlin smiled, picked up a towel, and began to bathe his little daughter. Mu Yun didn't play with the little sheep anymore, so he went to take a bath. Qin Amlin smiled. He picked up a towel and began to bathe his little daughter. Little Muyun didn't have the little sheep to play with, so she obediently went to bathe herself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Muyun slept by himself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Muyun slept by himself. He put the little girl on the bed and wiped her dry with a towel. The little girl rolled on the bed happily. Chapter 16:25. The corners of Qin Amlin's mouth curled up slightly as he lowered his head and kissed the little girl's belly. It smelled so good. He helped little Moo Moo put on the onesie and then carried her to the kitchen. He carried the baby in one hand and quickly made milk powder with the other. His movements were so skillful that it was as if he had practiced it thousands of times. As soon as little Moo Moo smelled it, she sucked greedily. Qin Amlin carried her to the bedroom and lay on her side, letting the little girl lie in his arms. Her two chubby little hands held the bottle, and she ate happily. She had been eating milk powder since she was young, so she was very satisfied. It wasn't that Qin Amlin couldn't find a nanny for her, but he just didn't want to. Little Moo Moo drank more than half a bottle and was sleepy. Her eyelids were fighting. She held the bottle and drank 2 mouthfuls, then let go. After a while, she held the bottle and drank 2 more mouthfuls in a daze. Finally, her little face tilted and the bottle slipped from her hand. The little guy squeezed into Qin Amlin's embrace and placed a small hand on his Xiong's chest. Every single fingernail on that chubby little hand was pink, especially the fingernails. They were all clean. Qin Amlin lowered his head and looked at her. He couldn't get tired of looking at her. Although he was angry with Lianxiu, he loved this child very much. If he had to choose between Momo and little Moo Moo, he would rather have little Moo Moo by his side. Momo was a boy, and little Moo Moo was so fragile and small. He sighed and couldn't help but think of Momo. She was also his child. How could he not think of her? After taking a shower, Yumuyun came in wearing a bathrobe. After running in, he climbed onto the bed and said, "I'll take care of Moo Moo." Qin Amlin kissed his son. This child was so sensible that it made his heart ache. He gently let go of little Moo Moo, and Yumuyun quickly replaced him. But a tragedy happened. Little Moo Moo woke up with a start and opened his eyes blankly. Then, he subconsciously went to look for his milk bottle. He didn't find the milk bottle and instead bit his brother. Yumuyun was helpless. Moo Moo, but little Moo Moo couldn't care less. He quickly took 2 bites and didn't eat anything. Cry, cry, cry. Yumuyun quickly stuffed the bottle into her mouth. Qin Amlin smiled and walked into the bathroom with his clothes. When he came out, the 2 little ones were asleep, their heads leaning against each other. Little Moo Moo even put one of his fat legs on little Moo Yun's waist. Qin Amlin covered the children with the quilt and looked at them quietly for a long time. Then, he turned around and went out to the living room. Sitting on the sofa in front of the French window, he poured himself a glass of wine. The night was just right, but he didn't feel sleepy. Now, she was drinking with Jie. Would he be drunk? Would he have an accident on his way back? Qin Amlin took the phone and put his finger on it for a long time, but he didn't make the call. What was this? She had nothing to do with him. Why did he have to worry about her so much? After a long time, he put down the phone and sat there, sipping the red wine and looking at the night sky. It wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning that his phone rang. It was Jie's phone call. He picked up almost immediately. It was a young man's voice. "Sir, we're at Night Bar. There are 2 ladies here who are drunk and haven't paid the bill. We're going to fake it. Night Bar. Drunk to death. Haven't paid the bill." Chapter 16:26. Qin Amlin sat in the car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Occasionally, the light from the window shone into the car, shining on his expressionless face and bottomless black eyes, but it seemed as if there were flames dancing in his eyes. The black sports car sped in the dark night, like a black bullet. Half an hour later, the car stopped at the night bar. At 3 o'clock in the night, the bar had been cleared, and only a few waiters were cleaning up. However, Qin Amlin still saw Jie and Lianxiu at a glance. They were both lying on the table, and there were more than a dozen empty bottles on the table. He knew how much Lianxiu could drink, and it was impossible for her to get drunk after drinking so little. However, when he approached, his face darkened because there were 2 bottles of wine. The 2 women drank 2 bottles of wine, and there was so much beer. Were they crazy? The bartender saw Qin Anlin walk in, followed him, and took out a bill. This is the bill for these 2 ladies, a total of 86,000 yuan. Qin Anlin's face darkened, and he took out a card for the bartender to swipe. Yi Lianxiu heard the noise, and she was still drinking with Ying Jie. At this time, she raised her eyes, looked at Qin Anlin, and closed her eyes again, and said with a drowsy voice, "I'll pay myself." Ying Jie also drank too much. She was usually such a strict person, but at this time, she was actually drooling. She leaned on the table and smiled vaguely. "Liangxiu, pay tens of thousands more, and let the most handsome man here drink with us, and then bring him to the hotel." Yi Liangxiu also smiled, and her fingers crookedly took out 200 yuan from her wallet. "This is 2 million, by the most handsome male prostitute here." The bartender was also used to seeing such female customers, and he had seen many of them who could do anything when they were drunk. He coughed lightly. "We are doing business here. Liangxiu," he said, "they're serious." Ying Jie, with tears and snot running down her face, slapped the table and laughed like a child. "Then why don't you let them try being serious?" Yi Liangxiu raised her hand at her and stood up shakily. Using Qin Anlin as a support, she walked to the bartender. She was very tall and hooked her arms around the bartender's neck. Her face was right in front of his, and her voice was sweet and alluring. "Are you selling it?" Although the bartender was used to seeing all kinds of beauties, the one in his arms was truly extraordinary. Her beauty, her softness, was like a kind of seductive fragrance, deeply intoxicating. The bartender didn't know what to do, but just as he was hesitating, Qin Anlin pulled Yi Lianxiu back. Her body fell into his arms, and her head bumped his chin. Qin Anlin let out a muffled groan and reached out to press her body. He looked at the bartender coldly. "What are you waiting for?" Yi Lianxiu struggled. "Let go of me. Let you go seduce other men." He held her body and didn't let her move, and his voice was as cold as ice. Yi Lianxiu turned her body sideways, and her eyes were a little blurred. Anlin, his jaw tightened, giving off a seductive vibe. She looked at him in a daze, and then stroked his chin with her fingers. There was a faint green color there, and it was slightly prickly. She felt that it was fun, and so she played with it for a while. He let her do as she pleased, but his expression didn't look good. After a while, she leaned on his shoulder and laughed softly. "You look like my ex-husband." Chapter 16:27. Yeah. She was still smiling foolishly as she buried her face in his shoulder. "My ex-husband, Qin Anlin." She leaned close to his ear. "Let me tell you a secret. My ex-husband can't do it." This time, Qin Anlin's face was completely green. He glared at her, but she just laughed on his shoulder and exhaled. "Can you do it?" Qin Anlin stood up straight. "I'll let you know if you can or can't." He turned his head and looked at Ying Jie with a complicated expression. At that moment, Ying Jie was sitting there calmly. She lit a cigarette and started smoking. Looking at Qin Anlin's gaze, Ying Jie smiled faintly. "Take her away. Leave this to me." Even after drinking so much alcohol, Ying Jie was still the same Ying Jie. She was calm as usual. That was why she was the best manager in the entertainment industry. Qin Anlin nodded. "I'll get Kaim to come and pick you up." No matter how drunk he was, he couldn't drive the car. But he didn't realize that when Ying Jie heard Kaim's name, her body trembled. With that, Qin Anlin locked Yi Liangxiu's fingers. After taking her things, he walked towards the door. Yi Liangxiu didn't want to let him go. She used her bag to hit his shoulder. She hit him so hard that he got angry and carried her on his shoulder. "Let go of me." She felt terrible. Not only did she feel dizzy, her stomach was churning and she wanted to vomit. But he didn't let go and carried her on his shoulder. At the entrance of the bar, she finally couldn't take it anymore. She locked her fingers on his shoulder. Qin Anlin was stunned. He put her down and watched as she ran to the side of the road and threw up. After she was done, she leaned against the side of the garden as if she had fallen asleep. He stood there and looked at her quietly. He wanted to ignore her. But after taking 2 steps, he cursed under his breath and came back with large strides. He picked her up and angrily used his hand to wipe away the stain at the side of her mouth. It was unwise to send her back at this time. In the end, he decided to send her to a hotel and get a room for her. 300 meters ahead was the GM. Sheen Amlin carried her on his back as they walked on the streets of B City. The neon lights shone on their faces, blurred and blurred, just like the relationship between them. No matter how cold he was, he couldn't let her go. Yuliancio leaned on his shoulder and put her lips to his neck. Sheen Amlin, isn't he your ex-husband? Don't you think I'm a pretty boy? His tone was not good, and his face was dark. Yuliancio, however, acted as if she hadn't heard anything as she smiled foolishly. Kaim is waiting for Su Cheng, but what about Ingjie? Sheen Hong Amlin frowns. Ingjie? Does this have anything to do with Ingjie? Ingjie had been at King Entertainment for many years. He had long thought that she had no interest in marriage or men. Ingjie likes Kaim. Yuliancio hugged him tightly and sighed. And you asked Kaim to pick her up. Sheen Amlin's attention was diverted. He wanted to ask her if she was really drunk or just pretending. But he didn't ask and only slowed down his pace. Perhaps it was only when she was drunk that they could be together like before without any scruples. He walked for more than half an hour for the short distance of a few hundred meters. Her hands tightened, so tightly that his heart heated up and he almost couldn't breathe. Amlin, Amlin. She called his name. Do you hate me? Chapter 16:28. Sheen Amlin had already carried her into the GM's lobby. He patted her and said, Yuliancio, you stink. She was so drunk, and yet she still wanted to seduce men? The GM employees all knew Sheen Amlin and Yuliancio. It was the middle of the night, and yet this couple, who were not together, had come to the hotel so late at night. It was quite surprising. No matter how surprised she was, she quickly handed the key to a presidential suite to Sheen Amlin and said carefully, Our little boss Pei said that whether President Sheen, Mr. Yi, or both of them at the same time, the GM would provide services for free. With that, she blinked. The presidential suite has 0.01 yuan. Sheen Amlin's face darkened. What did she mean by he had needs? Yuliancio had needs. Pei Chi. He gritted his teeth. However, the woman behind him did not give him any face at all. She giggled and said, All right, I'll come more often in the future. The receptionist looked carefully at Sheen Amlin and found that his face had turned green. He angrily asked Yuliancio to walk on her own, but she still clung to him and insisted on carrying him. The receptionist did not dare to laugh and sent them off. Sheen Amlin carried the drunk cat to the suite and threw her on the bed. He was furious and did not want to talk to her. Thus, he walked straight to the door. A pair of soft hands hugged his waist from behind. Then, she pressed her face against his back. She pressed against him and murmured, Amlin, don't go. His body froze. Yuliancio, do you know what you're saying? Don't go. She murmured. At least not tonight. She hugged his body without a care. She closed her eyes slightly and blushed. She started kissing him through his shirt. Although it was autumn and he didn't wear much, his body was boiling hot. Sheen Amlin stood still. After a long time, he said in a painful voice, Yuliancio, do you know what you are doing? I know. She hugged him tightly. I know. After she said, I know countless times, he finally couldn't take it anymore and turned his head, cupped her face, and kissed her. He didn't care if she was a dirty child or not. He didn't care about the past. He only cared about the present. He wanted to kiss her and take her. He was so tense that it hurt. He folded her in his arms, so she also felt pain. Her body moved back, and in the end, she half knelt beside the bed. He lowered his head and kissed her, his large palm pressing against the back of her head. It was like the end of the world. It was like the last time. He carried all his emotions. His anger towards her, his unforgiveness towards her, his love for her, and his reluctance to part with her were all in this kiss. They stumbled and fell together. She lay on her back, looked at him, and gently stroked his eyebrows with her fingers. Amlin, do you hate me? He was a little more clear-headed now. He half propped himself up and gazed at her deeply. After a long time, he said softly, "Hate me." He flipped himself to the side, fell down, and closed his eyes. "You're not drunk, are you?" "I'm drunk. I'm awake again." "I'm drunk again," she said softly. Her heart was also sad. In the end, he didn't want her. She knew that he couldn't get over it, which also showed how unforgiving he was. She moved herself, put her face on his shoulder, and said softly, "Amlin, will you be with Xiaomian?" He didn't answer. He turned sideways and held her little face, making her look at him. Chapter 16:29. Yuliancio raised her head slightly and touched his neck. "Just like this, to let her do the same to you." He pulled her down and said sternly, "Yuliancio." She chuckled. "Amlin, I thought you had imagined it." Perhaps because she was too despicable and he hated her too much, he turned over and pressed her down to kiss her. This time, he did not stop and did it thoroughly. When it was over, he seemed to regret it a little. He wrapped a towel around himself and leaned against the headboard, holding a cigarette in his hand. Yuliancio fell asleep. She lay on her side, revealing her creamy back. He smoked silently. After venting, his body felt even emptier. Loneliness engulfed his soul. He felt terrible and lowered his head to look at her. She was in a deep sleep. She was drunk and had fallen into a deep sleep. However, his heart was as heavy as water. Her drunken stupor was not as simple as it seemed. He smoked for a long time, and Yuliancio, who had fallen asleep, woke up. "Amlin?" She called his name softly. Sheen Amlin narrowed his eyes. After a long time, he threw away the cigarette in his hand. "I can't sleep." Before she could say anything, he laid on top of her. It was different from before. This time, he was obviously much more rough, as though he was venting some unknown emotions. After torturing her for a long time, he only let go of her when the sky was bright. At this moment, not only her, but he was also exhausted. They lay down in each other's arms. Perhaps it was only when they were weak and confused that they could embrace each other and be together peacefully. At 10 in the morning, Yuliancio woke up slowly. She hugged her pillow. He had already left. She did not open her eyes. She could only smell the faint smell of tobacco in the air. This round of sex was not within their expectations. It was something she had done on the spur of the moment. She was afraid of losing, so she gave. Sitting up, her gaze landed on the rubbish bin at the side. There were 7 or 8 zero ones there, all from last night. As the saying goes, hunger and thirst. She smiled, got up, and walked into the bathroom. Lying in the bathtub, she looked at her skin that had been tortured beyond recognition. He hadn't changed at all. It was just that in that kind of situation, he was a bit more resentful. Naturally, he was more ruthless than before. Yuliancio scooped up the water and was thinking when the bathroom door opened. Sheen Amlin stood neatly at the door with a paper bag in her hand. Judging from the label, it was what she usually wore. "Change your clothes. I'll send you to the company later." Yuliancio was still lying in the bathtub. She smiled and said, "I thought you left." He gave her a long look and said nothing. Yuliancio splashed the water and slowly got up. His gaze fell on her body, and he looked at her deeply. "Get dressed and come out for breakfast," he lightly ordered. She slowly wiped her body with a towel, and after a while, she said softly, "You look like you're not satisfied yet." "If I wasn't satisfied, I wouldn't have troubled Mr. Yi." He lowered his head in annoyance, turned around, and walked out. She smiled faintly. She didn't mean what she said. When she got dressed and went out, Sheen Amlin was already sitting in the dining room. The amazing thing was that the bedroom had been cleaned. The 8 0-0-1s had become the topic of conversation for the GM. "Eat quickly," he lightly said, watching her sit down. Yuliancio tasted it and knew that it was what she usually ate. She looked up and asked, "You went out to buy it?" Chapter 16:30. Yuliancio didn't say anything else and just quietly ate her porridge. Occasionally, she would look up and see Sheen Amlin scrolling through the news on his cell phone. She would then lower her head and take a small sip of porridge. After a long time, he put his cell phone away and looked at her quietly. "Done eating?" She replied and wiped her lower lip. "Let's go." Sheen Anlin looked at her for a long time before saying lightly, "Okay." He walked out first and lit a cigarette at the door to wait for her. When Iliancio walked out, she looked at him and said, "You smoked so much. Are you worried about me?" He smiled coldly. "You don't have to." As he walked, he said, "I took precautions last night, so there won't be any unbreakable relationship between us." Iliancio stopped in her tracks and didn't leave. He turned his head and looked at her, pursing his lips. "What's the matter now?" She looked at him for a long time before saying slowly, "Sheen Anlin, you're getting more and more duplicitous. Do you know that?" Sheen Anlin glared at her. After a while, he walked forward and extinguished the cigarette butt. She stood behind him and smiled quietly. She seemed to be in a good mood as she followed behind him. When they reached the hotel lobby, the receptionist looked at Sheen Anlin with awe. After all, he had broken the highest record of the night at GM Hotel, which was 8 Cinemoto Platinum. However, Sheen Anlin's face was dark, and he walked out quickly. So did Iliancio. She put on her sunglasses and didn't dare to take a single step. The two of them went out together. At the entrance of GM Hotel, they were surrounded by more than 10 reporters. The cameras were frantically taking pictures of them. Of course, they could also capture the kiss marks on Iliancio's neck and the shallow scratch marks on Sheen Anlin's neck. Sheen Anlin was a little annoyed. He reached out to block the camera and instinctively pulled Iliancio behind him. "Mr. Sheen, have you reconciled with Miss Yi?" "President Sheen, I want to know if you and Miss Yi have ever divorced." "President Sheen, did you and Miss Yi sleep in the same room last night?" Sheen Anlin's face was dark. He pushed those people away and pulled Iliancio to the parking lot. He got into the car and blocked the annoying reporters outside, but his expression was still not good. Iliancio turned to look at him. "Why are you so angry? What do you think, Mr. Yi? Who would benefit the most from the release of this news?" His voice was a little cold, completely different from the fiery passion of last night. "So, you guessed it was me?" She didn't think much of it. She just leaned against the back of the chair and looked out the window. After a long time, she turned around and smiled. "But President Sheen, you're right. I did it. Because ATV needs such favorable news, I think ATV stock will rise a lot today. President Sheen, it's all thanks to you." "Iliancio." He squeezed out the words from between his teeth. Was everything last night a trap? "If President Sheen can bear such a result, I say yes," she said softly in a very indifferent tone. Sheen Anlin narrowed his eyes, and the car stopped by the side of the road. With a squeak, the back of her head hit the back of the chair. She turned her head to look at him. "Get out of the car." His voice was as cold as ice. He turned his head, and his eyes were also cold. "Iliancio, you're good." She put her hand on the handle of the car door and smiled. "Thank you, President Sheen, for your compliment." "Get out of the car," he said again. She opened the car door and got out without hesitation. Chapter 16:31. Only then did she realize that her bag and cell phone were in his car. She didn't have a single cent on her, and she was wearing high heels. She stared in the direction of his car for a long time, and her eyes were steaming. She had said those words out of anger just now. Yes, she had deliberately seduced him, but that was limited to the relationship between them and had nothing to do with the interests of ATV. The appearance of those reporters was clearly the work of someone with ulterior motives. As for who it was, she could guess. What made her angry was that he didn't even ask her to explain and directly suspected her. It was good that it was a misunderstanding. It would be good if he died of anger. She thought a little angrily as she walked forward in her 3-inch high heels. How far was it? It didn't matter how long her legs were. She had no cell phone, no money, and her legs were very sore and painful. She simply sat on a bench by the side of the road. She actually saw a few coins in the mud. She carefully dug them out. Although there was only mud on them, it made her feel that her luck wasn't that bad. She washed the coins and found a random bus to sit on. She didn't care where she was going. She just wanted to sit. She needed to calm down. She would be sad too. "Sheen Anlin, I'm not invulnerable, and I'm not made of iron. I can get hurt too." She sat in an unknown place for the whole morning. When the news of them staying together for a night came out, the news in B City blew up. The shareholders of King Entertainment put a lot of pressure on Sheen Anlin. One had to know that King Entertainment was committed to buying ATV. Now that such news had come out, wasn't it giving the other party a chance to breathe? As long as Yu Liangxiu accepted an interview and said that her marriage with President Sheen was good, then ATV might be able to get out of its doldrums. Moreover, Yu Liangxiu's identity as a celebrity queen was still very appealing. Sheen Anlin held a meeting for the whole morning. His face was getting darker and darker. In the end, it was so dark that it could drip water. When the meeting ended, Kim followed him into the office with a serious expression. President Sheen, what should we do now? Sheen Anlin didn't speak. Kim continued. The two things that the shareholders said today are simply nonsense. It sounds like they are trying to force him to abdicate. It was ridiculous. She said that she could either ask President Sheen to divorce or hold a press conference to announce that they were separated. Sheen Anlin sat behind his desk and said calmly, she said she did it. Kim was stunned. Then he said slowly, President Sheen, no matter what happened between you and Miss Yi, I don't think she will. He paused. She should be afraid. Sheen Anlin looked at him. You're afraid of losing it, so you're desperately trying to hold on to it. Kim smiled bitterly. I know this feeling the best. Sheen Anlin pursed his lips and said nothing more. As for why she said that, President Sheen can ask her. Just don't cause further misunderstanding. Kim sighed and walked out, leaving Sheen Anlin alone. When he walked out, Kim smoked a cigarette and looked a little lost. Last night, he had gone to pick up Jie. Jie didn't seem to be drunk, but she was actually drunk. Later, she had vomited in his car. After vomiting, she had told him a story in the night. It was a familiar, sad, and long story. The main characters of the story were him and Jie. Jie had always liked a boy who was much younger than her. She had always liked him, and she had always been waiting for that person to speak. However, he couldn't speak. Chapter 1632. Last night, Kim and Jie sat in that bar all night. She said a lot of drunken things, and he listened in silence, but he didn't respond. When she cried, he gave her a shoulder, but he couldn't give her a hug. His hug was given to Su Cheng, to Nian Yan's mother. Yes, his and Su Cheng's child was called Su Nian. After his mother found out that the child's surname was Su and his name was Su Nian, she was silent for a long time and didn't say anything. After that, she didn't force him to go on blind dates again and only helped him take care of the child. She probably knew that he was waiting for Su Cheng, and it was useless for her to force him, so she didn't force him. That night, Jie said a lot, and he remembered it all in his heart. But he could only remember it in his heart and nothing else. Kim finished a cigarette and smiled faintly. He might feel a little melancholy, but he wouldn't regret it. Falling in love with someone and missing out on someone, what was there to regret? His Ching Cheng was more passionate than anyone else, and he wasn't dissatisfied with anything. Just thinking about her little vixen appearance, his heart was also satisfied. After Kim left, Sheen Anlin sat in his office and repeatedly watched the news about him and Yu Liangxiu, his body leaning heavily against the back of the chair. At this moment, it wasn't that he didn't feel conflicted. His heart had softened toward her. In fact, no matter who did it, he should kill ATV right now. The shareholder's suggestion was very effective, and it was what he should do. But he still couldn't kill her. Before Yu Liangxiu took over ATV, he had forced ATV into a corner and abandoned many projects. But after she took over, he didn't move forward. He reached out to wipe his face and looked at the bag and phone beside him. It was Yu Liangxiu who dropped in his car. He pursed his lips, picked it up, and slid open her phone. She had saved the photo of them in her phone, especially the one taken when they sat on the bed together. She had always kept it as slender fingers slowly stroked her face in the photo, and after a long time, he put it down. He reached out and pressed the intercom. Kim came over after a while. Knowing that he had made up his mind, he waited quietly. Break a piece of news and suppress this one. Sheen Anlin's tone was flat. Kim smiled. Yes, President Sheen. Just like that, there was no movement. Sheen Anlin lowered his eyes and lit a cigarette. Kim coughed lightly. President Sheen, don't smoke so much. Sheen Anlin looked at him for a long time, then slowly said, "You're different." Kime retreated out of the room. When he went out, Cheen Amlin looked at the cigarette between his fingers, and his expression was a little serious. He remembered that when he smoked yesterday, Liangxiu also said the same thing. "Amlin, smoke less. Does she still care about him?" Cheen Amlin pressed the internal line again, and Kime came over again. "Send this to ATV and hand it over to Boss Yi." He pointed to the woman's handbag and mobile phone at the side. Kime was stunned for a moment. "Then Mr. Yi is—" He paused. "Does Mr. Yi have money on him?" Cheen Amlin looked at him and pursed his lips. "Send it over and hand it to her personally." Kime understood that he obviously couldn't let it go. So he drove to the ATV personally, but he didn't see Yi Liangxiu. He heard from Linda that Mr. Yi hadn't come back and couldn't be contacted. Chapter 1633. By then, it was already afternoon. Cheen Amlin drove with one hand and held a cigarette in the other, looking straight ahead. He had mixed feelings. He should be cruel to her, but he couldn't do it. He kept pushing his limits, including the duty of having sex with her. Cheen Amlin was, after all, a man who had indulged himself for an entire night, so he didn't eat much. He drove around like this for 2 or 3 hours, and when night fell, his legs were no longer soft. However, he didn't give up and continued to search. Linda would also keep an eye out for her to see if she returned to the Sioux residence or the company, but there was still no news of her at 7 at night. Cheen Amlin threw away the cigarette, but wiped his face and continued to drive. It was an early autumn night, and it drizzled, forming a cold reflection on the road. There were fewer and fewer pedestrians, and even the occasional bus that passed by only had 2 or 3 people in it. Cheen Amlin drove past a bus. In a flash, he saw Yi Liangxiu sitting by the window. Her long hair was loose, and the window was down. She reached out, as if to catch the drizzle from the sky. Her expression was almost pious as she looked up at the sky at a 45-degree angle. At that time, she didn't look like a 28-year-old woman, but a 19-year-old girl. At that moment, Cheen Amlin felt the whole sky was gorgeous, as if countless fireworks were blooming in front of her. Her facial features and even her pores were so clearly visible under the street lights in the dark night. The car passed by, as if in slow motion. He looked up, almost looking up. At that moment, she was in a sorry state, but his heart was violently moved, and only she could move him like this. As long as she was willing, she could always be the Yi Liangxiu who stood at the top. The black sports car screeched and made a sharp turn, following the bus from afar. He didn't want to be discovered by her, so he greedily looked at her happy face. Happy, but he could still see a touch of sadness. It had been a long time since he had seen her new work, but he still believed that Yi Liangxiu's performance was the highest level of performance. It made him forget about her, forget that she was the woman he loved and hated. But he hated her. Did she know it was dangerous? The car followed the bus all the way to the bus stop. She finally got out of the car. She got out of the car alone. She stood below and said something to the chauffeur. She smiled and then looked over. Cheen Amlin had already gotten out of the car. He leaned against the door and looked at her deeply. Yi Liangxiu walked towards him slowly. "I gave the driver an autograph, and he let me ride for a day. So, you didn't care about other people's worries and just took the bus around alone for a day?" His voice was repressed and a little strict. He wanted to ask her if she had eaten, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. Because if he did that, it would seem like he cared too much. "Yeah." She was still smiling, looking a little carefree. "You have to hide after doing something wrong." He looked at her deeply and frowned. After a long time, he took her bag and cell phone from the car. She took it. "Thank you." He didn't move, but his gaze deepened. Chapter 1634. She walked forward on the empty street. She didn't seem to mind and walked casually on her own. As he looked at her, his eyes were a little hot, and he was a little annoyed at her. Suddenly, he grabbed her arm and dug his fingers deep into her flesh. However, she didn't seem to feel any pain as she turned around and smiled. "What's wrong? You called me Amlin." He spat out word by word. "Yi Liangxiu, you deserve to die. How can you act as though nothing happened, as though it has nothing to do with you? All the love and hate I have for you are just my own imagination, he said angrily before lowering his head and kissing her. His arms locked her body as he pulled her into his embrace. He hugged her so deeply as though he wanted to carve this woman into his bones and blood. Their lips rubbed against each other like boiling lava, burning her and him at the same time. They hugged each other and stumbled around, but there was nowhere for them to lean on. In the end, they ended up leaning against a tree trunk. He kissed her passionately. Her breath was sucked out of her as she couldn't breathe and could only cling on to him. He let out a gasp and kissed her crazily. Finally, he let go of her before both of them were suffocated. Her breathing was messy as she leaned her head against the tree trunk and looked up at him. Her eyes were beautiful as though they were filled with the entire starry sky. He suddenly covered her eyes with his hand and said hoarsely, "Yi Liangxiu, I actually hate you." She panted for a long time before she removed his hand. I know. Their gazes met for a long time in silence. His unwillingness, his wretched state, and his willingness to let go, they were all clear and aware of it. That was why there was such a rough kiss. Her red lips were still slightly swollen at this moment. He took a step back and seemed to have calmed down. "I'll send you back." She didn't reject him because she was really tired. Qin Amlin walked towards the car and said indifferently, "There's no use in hurting yourself. I won't go soft no matter what." She followed behind him. She knew what he was talking about. She got into the car and fastened the seatbelt. "You didn't do anything today." Qin Amlin tilted his head and looked at her in an unfriendly manner. He slowly said, "Just think of it as last night's fare. It's so expensive." Yi Liangxiu rubbed her fingers. "Even ATV's stock rose today, and it's probably worth billions." Qin Amlin was a little annoyed. "Yi Liangxiu, don't go too far." "Is that so? President Qin, did I go too far?" Yi Liangxiu sneered. "As for your accusation, I just didn't deny it, and you think I did it? Why don't you doubt if it's a romantic debt? Why don't you think it's a stupid thing done by your girlfriend with a low IQ?" Qin Amlin was stunned. Yi Liangxiu smiled faintly again. "President Qin, I believe your IQ should be on the line." He was almost fuming with anger. "Why didn't you deny it in the morning?" "Because you suspected me. It's not the first time I've experienced something like pulling on my pants and refusing to admit it." Her voice also became cold. "But I still want to thank President Qin for not killing me and coming to find me. Is it hard?" Her face was sincere, but in his eyes, it was extremely hateful. When did Yi Liangxiu become so cunning? Chapter 16:35. "You won't sleep with me, or you won't be so stupid again?" she asked fearlessly. Qin Amlin clenched his fists. He really wanted to throw a tantrum at that little face, but he realized he couldn't. When a woman turns on you, you know how powerless you are. But he knew, more bitterly, that it was because he loved her dearly. "There won't be a next time." He added, "I won't sleep with you again." She nodded in agreement. After all, there are still many women in the harem of King Entertainment who can satisfy you. He glared at her and ignored her. He sat up straight and started the car. She said fearlessly, "Qin Amlin, you better not have a baby or I'll sue you for adultery." He couldn't take it anymore. "Get out." She really wanted to get out, but he still held her down. With nowhere to vent his complicated emotions, he started the car angrily. But the car was a little fast. It was a little frightening in the rainy night. Yi Liangxiu's fingers were on her chest, and her face was pale. "Qin Amlin, I haven't eaten for a day. I want to throw up." He didn't look too good, but he slowed down the car. After driving a few roads, he found a porridge shop and parked the car on the side of the road. The shop wasn't big and had a small storefront, but it was very clean. She sat in the car and didn't move. Qin Amlin took out a cigarette and lit it. When he lowered his head to light the fire, he said calmly, "Didn't you say you were hungry? Get out." She looked at him as if she had just woken up from a dream. She opened the car door slowly, but her hand was held down by him. "Yi Liangxiu, this is the last time I'm going to compromise for you." His voice was low and hoarse, filled with indignation. She said "oh" again, which was rare for her to be so naive and sweet. "Don't give me that. I'm not having it." His voice was tense, and had a hint of huskiness. Yuliancio said, "Oh, again." After a long time, she asked, "Then what do you want to eat?" In the dark car, his gaze was deep, as if there was a flame in it as he looked at her. Her body shuddered. They both remembered the nights they had shared, the joy and love they had shared, how he had taken her little by little, eaten her up, and how she couldn't take it anymore. "Get out of the car." Finally, he said hoarsely and let go of her. Her body felt light, and she almost slipped when she got out of the car. The sky was still drizzling, and it felt cold when she went out. She wrapped her arms around the mouth of the Xiong family. Soon, a coat was put on her shoulders, and she looked up in surprise. "Go in." Qin Anlin was only wearing a black shirt and holding a cigarette in his hand, but he still looked noble. He was out of place here, but his expression was one of extreme ease. When the lady boss of the kanji shop saw the handsome man, she happily greeted him. "Sir, madam, what would you like to eat?" Qin Anlin sat down and looked at Yuliancio. "What do you want to eat?" "Seafood porridge," she said without thinking. However, Qin Anlin said, 2 servings of lean pork with century eggs and a plate of beef river." "I want seafood porridge," she emphasized. Qin Anlin looked at her. "You're cold and you still want to eat seafood?" "Yuliancio, do you want to rely on me when you're sick?" The lady boss looked at one and the other and was still grinning from ear to ear. She was especially good at chatting. "Oh, I thought it was a couple. It's a farewell meal for little Jing. My place is close to the hotel, so there are many people who come to this meal. But everyone is still friends after this meal." The lady boss even winked at Qin Anlin, indicating that she was still single and could ask him out. Chapter 1636. The moment Qin Anlin finished speaking, the lady boss blushed. "Ah, why didn't you say so earlier?" With that said, she turned her thick waist and went to place the order. Yuliancio looked around. The customers sitting around were dressed rather casually. They must be the residents living nearby. She inadvertently raised her eyes to look at Qin Anlin. He was currently smoking and looking at her with a burning gaze. Yuliancio's eyes narrowed. Then she took out her phone and played with it. "Why did you keep my photo?" His voice suddenly sounded, giving her a shock. She looked at him and looked down. "I'll just delete it. You could try." His voice was low and slightly cold. She looked at him strangely again. His gaze was also gloomy, as if she owed him 3 million yuan. However, what she owed him was not just 3 million yuan. She owed him a life, his mother's life. Her eyes dimmed, and she did not speak anymore. There was a subtle feeling between the two of them. After a while, the owner of the wind flea came over with a 7-inch bucket waist. She held a tray in her hand and put down the things that Qin Anlin had ordered one by one. She smiled charmingly. "How can a couple not quarrel? Come to my place for supper and good food. It's not a small amount." With that said, she glanced at the hotel not far away. "If you can't have a meal, you can rest there. After a night of rolling in the sheets, there won't be any more conflicts." After he finished speaking, he glanced at Qin Anlin in an especially seductive manner. His gaze paused on his Xiongnu mouth for a moment, and only then did he twist his thick waist and leave, his eyes filled with all kinds of emotions. Qin Anlin and Yuliancio looked at each other. After a long while, she sighed softly. "The lady boss is quite passionate. If she was younger, she would have liked you." Qin Anlin reached for his bowl. After taking a bite, he looked up. "Yuliancio, no one will think that you're mute if you don't speak." He paused. "Or do you want to go to the hotel over there?" Yuliancio was hungry. She took small bites and said softly, "You're the one who wants to go with Lady Boss." He glared at her, but she said nothing more. The warm porridge soothed her stomach, and she even let out a soft sigh of satisfaction. He caught it, and after looking up at her, he didn't say anything. After Yuliancio finished her porridge, she began to attack the Panyo River. The taste was unexpectedly good. She had only moved her chopsticks a few times when Qin Anlin also extended his chopsticks and blocked her chopsticks. The two of them were like children competing with each other. "Qin Anlin, you're childish." She couldn't beat him, so she flew into a rage out of humiliation. He ate gracefully. Even though it was a snack shop, he could still eat with dignity. After finishing half of the plate, He rewarded her. Don't you want to maintain your figure? Besides, people who have been starving for a long time should not overeat. She looked at the plate of porridge that he had eaten. Actually, she wanted to eat it, but he had already finished half the plate, so it was a little strange for her to eat again. Cheen Anlin lit a cigarette. Why? Do you think it's dirty? She was afraid that he would say something shameless again, so she lowered her head and ate without making a fuss. Before Cheen Anlin could say anything, the lady boss came out. When she saw the scene, she couldn't stop smiling. I knew it. A meal is enough. The lady boss wiped her hands and suddenly took out a coupon from her greasy pocket. She said mysteriously, "Take this and stay there. You can get a 20% discount." Chapter 1637. After saying that, the lady boss bit her plump lips, shook her waist, and left. Yulianchio's mouth was still full of food as she stared at Cheen Anlin with her eyes wide open. Cheen Anlin was also holding the coupon in his hand as he looked at her with a burning gaze. Just when she thought that he was going to throw it away, he folded it and put it in his pocket. Yulianchio spat out the stir-fried noodles in her mouth. Cheen Anlin glared at her, and there was some on his face too. Actually, she had never lost her composure like this before, but she never thought that he would be like this. How could Cheen Anlin be interested in such a cheap place? How do you know who I won't bring there? He wiped his face with a piece of tissue and was no longer in the mood. He paid the money first and waited for her in the car. Yulianchio snuck glances at him as he ate, and then secretly laughed. Cheen Anlin sat in the car with the window down. He smoked and looked at her from time to time, or rather, he was glaring at her. Yulianchio pursed her lips and couldn't help but smile. It had been a long time since he saw her smile like this. Although he hated her, he still looked at her greedily. She finished her food slowly, opened the car door, and sat beside him. Cheen Anlin still had half of his cigarette and looked at her. "Aren't you afraid that I'll drag you to a hotel?" "That's exactly what I want," she said mysteriously. Cheen Anlin glanced at her, his gaze cold. "Whatever." She opened her palm, and there was a coupon on it too. "The lady boss said that you're a little fierce and asked me to make plans in case it doesn't work out." Yulianchio chuckled. "I think it's better to find someone else." His face darkened as he glared at her. "Yulianchio, don't you dare. If you dare, I dare." She said these 5 words. She finally said these 5 words. "Cheen Anlin, this is not a threat. This is the truth." Her tone became cold. "If you mess around with any model or celebrity, I'll make sure you're cuckold too." She paused for a long time before continuing, "Unless we get a divorce." His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he put out the cigarette. "Yulianchio, you're the first one who dares to be so arrogant after doing something wrong." With that, he took the coupon from her hand, tore it into pieces, and threw it away. After that, he started the car. Probably because he was angry with her, he did not speak again until he dropped her off in front of the Sioux residence. He did not get out of the car. Instead, he sat in the car and his tone became cold. "What happened in the past 2 days ends here. I hope that Mr. Yi won't overthink it." "I won't overthink it, don't worry." Her voice was slightly bitter, and she looked down. "I'm leaving." His fingers closed on her arm, and she turned her head. In the dim light, his gaze was unfathomable as it locked onto her face. "Yulianchio, have you ever regretted it?" His voice was slightly hoarse. "Have you ever regretted your choice?" He was not a fool. He could still feel that she loved him. If she didn't love him, she wouldn't be willing to sleep with him, and she wouldn't eat with him. In this short day, she was even greedy for it. Even when she went missing today, she hoped that he would look for her. But Yulianchio, shouldn't she give something in order to get it? His gaze was burning, and she could not avoid it. She said softly, "I don't have a chance to regret it, Anlin. There's no turning back." Chapter 1638. Yulianchio go. Cheen Anlin's tone was calm. "Just pretend that nothing happened in the past 2 days." Yulianchio's gaze fell on his face. After a long while, she chuckled. "Okay." One was in the car, and the other was outside. Under the faint moonlight, their gazes met, and they stared at each other for a long time. He looked at her for a long time before he finally closed the car window. The black sports car disappeared into the night. She stood there for a long time, so long that she almost didn't want to return to the Sioux residence. Only when her legs were a little sore did she slowly walk in. The guard opened the door and said softly, "Sir is back." Sioux Shurchung? Why was he back? Shouldn't I be his tortoise, curling up and living a few more years? Yi Lianxiu walked toward the hall. Her footsteps were quick and without any hesitation. The guard looked at her back view and was a little worried. The Sioux residence was brightly lit. Sioux Shurchung was wearing a white suit and looked a little flustered. He was bending over and looking at little Momo lovingly. The moment she saw little Momo, her heart calmed down. She walked over slowly and said calmly, "You're here. This is my home." Sioux Shurchung looked up and frowned. He emphasized, but he didn't feel good. This was his home, but he had been in dire straits for the past year. He couldn't return home and was afraid that Qin Amlin would run over with a gun and point it at him at any time. He had to hide here and there, and his days were miserable. Yi Lianxiu smiled. "Yes, you can stay here for a long time, too." Sioux Shurchung was stunned. He was angry. He had given birth to this daughter for nothing. If he didn't need her, he wouldn't have had to be so submissive. His gaze shifted and landed on Yi Lianxiu. He closed his eyes and spat out a long sentence. "Who are you with?" Yi Lianxiu looked down at herself. She was wearing Qin Amlin's jacket, so she said calmly, "Qin Amlin." Sioux Shurchung opened his eyes and stared at her. Then, he handed little Momo over to a servant. When little Momo was carried upstairs, his gaze turned cold. "Bastard, how could you hang out with him? Have you forgotten your mission?" Yi Lianxiu took off her jacket, kicked off her high heels, and ignored Sioux Shurchung. She walked to the bar and poured herself a glass of red wine. After taking a sip, she said lightly, "Of course I didn't forget. There's no conflict." Sioux Shurchung's eyes were a little hot, because her attitude was too casual. It was as if she was used to this place and treated it as her real home. This was very subtle. It was not his home, but this place. It was Yi Lianxiu's home. Although he was unhappy, he continued to make things difficult for her and Qin Amlin. Yi Lianxiu smiled and said, "It's just a consensual act after getting drunk. It's nothing." "What about now?" Sioux Shurchung's eyes were shrewd. He narrowed his eyes and stared at her. "Are you drunk again tonight?" Yi Lianxiu held a glass of red wine and walked over to sit down. Her posture was perfect. She reached out to push her long hair to the back of her head and turned her face. "If you knew that the matter between me and Qin Amlin was on the news, you wouldn't have said that." Her expression was slightly cold. At this time, if Qin Amlin announced that we were divorcing or separating, do you think ATV would still be so calm today? She sneered. "You're probably anxious to hold a shareholders' meeting." Chapter 1639. You don't believe me? She held the glass and played with the expensive crystal glass with her slender fingers. She smiled and said, "Then I won't see him in private anymore." Sioux Shurchung hesitated when he heard that. Indeed, Yi Lianxiu was telling the truth. ATV was on its last breath. If Qin Amlin wanted to, he might not be able to hold on for long. Seeing that Sioux Shurchung didn't speak, Yi Lianxiu continued, "Qin Amlin doesn't like to use personal matters to suppress me. Why should I send myself to my death?" This time, Sioux Shurchung nodded and said, "That's true." He thought for a moment and said, shamelessly, "If necessary, you can contact him." He felt that it was too obvious, so he coughed and said, "You're still husband and wife, aren't you?" Yi Lianxiu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Sioux Shurchung chuckled and said, "Lianxiu, I'm not unreasonable. If you like Qin Amlin, you could be with him in the end," but his voice was resolute and decisive. "We have to take down King Entertainment. You should know what to do." "Honey trap? I might not be that charming." Yi Lianxiu smiled faintly. "He has so many beauties around him. Maybe he doesn't care anymore, or maybe one day he'll hate me." "Dad, you don't think he'll still like me when he realizes what I want to do you?" Sioux Shurchung smiled deeply and said, "That depends on your ability. But the beauties you mentioned just now, are you referring to the girl named Xiaomian?" Sioux Shurchung smiled darkly and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of her for you. Yi Liangxiu didn't say anything, nor did she refuse. Her heart had long been cold and hard. Xiao Mian, she had warned her. She held the red wine in her fingers and slowly drank half a glass. Su Shiqing looked at her with satisfaction and said, Liangxiu, you're becoming more and more like me. She tilted her face and smiled charmingly. Really? Su Shiqing frowned again and said, Don't you not smoke or drink? What about Momo? It's broken. Yi Liangxiu's voice sounded a little indifferent. You won't get drunk if you drink once in a while. Su Shiqing nodded. That's good. I have to go. I don't want to upset you here. He complained like a child. I really don't know if this is your house or my house. With that said, he walked out with his cane, followed by his bodyguards. Yi Liangxiu stopped him. Wait a minute. Su Shiqing stopped and turned back to look at her. Liangxiu, is he okay? Yi Liangxiu's voice was very faint. She stood there, dignified and beautiful, the most desirable heir to his heart. Now that Su Shiqing was old, he really wanted to hear her care for him, but she actually asked about that useless man, Qin Pei. Su Shiqing's gaze was slightly cold. He is not dead. With that said, he banged the cane in his hand hard on the floor tiles. Show her the photo. With that said, he stormed out of the room, looking a little sad. His subordinates wanted to show the photo to Yi Liangxiu, but Yi Liangxiu didn't look at it. She didn't want to see Qin Pei's miserable state. After staying alone for a while, she went upstairs to take care of Momo. But in her heart, she kept thinking about Qin Anlin, wondering if he was angry. But Anlin, no matter how angry you are, there's some things that I have to do. In the president's office of King Entertainment, Qin Anlin was sitting when someone knocked on the door. Chapter 1640. The door opened, and Xiao Mian followed behind Ing Jie, looking a little uneasy. Qin Anlin looked up at Ing Jie and said, Wait outside for a moment. Ing Jie nodded and glanced at Xiao Mian. From the look on the girl's face, she must have done something bad to upset President Qin. She backed out and closed the door. Xiao Mian stood by the door and didn't walk over. She clasped her hands and said in a soft voice, President Qin, I have rehearsal later. No need. Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. Starting from today, you'll have a month off. Xiao Mian's face turned pale, and she cried out involuntarily, Why? Qin Anlin's tone became even colder. You know the reason. Under that kind of gaze, Xiao Mian couldn't avoid it. She finally said in a soft voice, President Qin, I didn't do it on purpose. Biting her lip and looking down, she looked a little pitiful. I just don't think it's worth it for a woman like that. It's my business whether it's worth it or not. It's not up to others to interfere in my private affairs. Besides, Miss Ya is just an actress from King Entertainment. His voice was very cold. But do you know what it means to King Entertainment by doing this? President Qin can make a statement, Xiao Mian blurted out in a moment of desperation. But she regretted it as soon as she said it. Her face was a little pale, and her eyes were also a little teary as she looked at Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin's expression became even colder. His voice was slow and deep. How did you know about the contents of the shareholders' meeting? Xiao Mian didn't dare to look him in the eye. She turned her face to the side and said in an even lower voice, I heard it from someone. Qin Anlin didn't ask anymore, but his voice became even more stern. If there's a next time, you'll be fired from King Entertainment. It won't happen again. Xiao Mian's face turned paler and paler. He didn't say much to her because she was just an insignificant employee who had designs on him. But did he really not have any feelings for her? Xiao Mian sounded innocent and squeezed out a weak smile. I can help Aunt Su take care of Mu Yun and little Mumu this month. No need. Qin Anlin looked at her with a strange look in his eyes. Miss Ya, I hope you remember that we won't have anything to do with each other except in the company. Don't cross the line. Xiao Mian said yes with tears in her eyes. Qin Anlin didn't say anything more and raised his hand to let her go out. When Xiao Mian left, her eyes were red. Ing Jie immediately knew that she was the one who did it. That was why she was scolded by President Qin. President Qin asked you to come in. Xiao Mian's voice was a little hoarse. Jie nodded and glanced at Xiao Mian. Xiao Mian called out, Jie, in a soft voice, but Jie ignored her. Of course, she had to take responsibility for what she did. Jie pushed the door open and went in. Xiao Mian stood there, tears finally rolling down her face. She didn't know why President Qin knew about it. Someone must have sold her out. Those reporters took her money and dared to sell her out. Xiao Mian bit her lip, her eyes full of resentment. At that moment, there was a clapping sound on the other side of the aisle. Xiao Mian turned her head and saw that it was Immo Xiaoqi. In the past 6 months, she and Immo Xiaoqi had been fighting fiercely. Immo Xiaoqi bullied her because she was a founding member. But so what? In the future, it would be Xiao Mian's world. King Entertainment had nothing to do with that old woman Immo Xiaoqi. Chapter 1641. Immo Xiaoqi swayed her body as she walked over and stood in front of Xiao Mian. She played with her exquisite nails and said with a gloating tone, Xiao Mian, it's fine that you usually go head-on against me, but you actually overestimated yourself and provoked Liangxiu. How much courage do you have? How much beauty do you have? How much shrewdness do you have to scheme against her? Immo Xiaoqi smiled charmingly and leaned close to Xiao Mian. There are many women who want to sleep with President Qin, who have succeeded in all these years. Xiao Mian said coldly. Immo Xiaoqi, do you think everyone is like you? Immo Xiaoqi shrugged and laughed exaggeratedly. Don't be so arrogant. How can I not know what you're thinking? Don't look for shameless things to do. In President Qin's heart, there is only Yi Liangxiu. He is now Mr. Yi and the Queen of Music. Even if you struggle for 8 or 10 years, you can't reach his height. Immo Xiaoqi felt happy today. When Yi Liangxiu was around, she was unhappy, but this Xiao Mian made her even more unhappy. As for Yi Liangxiu, at least President Qin liked her. Xiao Mian, on the other hand, was stubbornly sticking to him and pretending to be innocent. Immo Xiaoqi hated her the most. Moreover, Xiao Mian dared to stab her in the back. Little girl, let's see if I can kill her. Immo Xiaoqi chuckled softly. By the way, don't cry. President Qin won't feel sorry for you. Looking at Xiao Mian's angry look, she was even happier. By the way, the night before yesterday, President Qin and Mr. Yi must have been separated for a long time. I heard that President Qin's neck was full of scratches. How much strength did he use? Xiao Mian, you were so close to him just now. Did you see it? Xiao Mian was so angry that she almost passed out. She said coldly, I didn't see it. That's true. President Qin doesn't allow you to get close to him. Immo Xiaoqi sighed. I still have work to do, so I can't talk to you. I really envy you for being so free. After Immo Xiaoqi finished speaking, she smiled mockingly and left. Xiao Mian stood there and clenched her fists. This Immo Xiaoqi was so hateful. She didn't leave. She wanted to wait for Jie at the door. She begged Sister Ing to put in a few good words for her. She could not disappear for a month. Otherwise, her fans would forget about her. That was how cruel the entertainment industry was. If you didn't have enough exposure, the public would soon forget you. Unlike Yi Liangxiu, Mian and Xiao Mian of Mian's, Mian, Xiao Mian, Mian, Su Mian. In fact, she didn't need to Qin. Su with her, Mian Mian un Xia Su. Man, she of Su, she and said, Su, Mian Mian of Yi Su up, Su Mian Su of. However, she still asked to test his reaction. Sure enough, Qin Anlin was stunned for a moment and then nodded. This matter is over. Just take it as another scandal. It won't cause any more trouble. Jie thought to herself that President Qin knew very well whether he could make a comeback or not. It was clear that Liangxiu had later retaliated against him, deliberately making him unable to bear it, but he still softened. What happened to being cold-hearted and merciless? They had all been fed to the dogs. However, she didn't dare to tease her boss, so she only asked Xiao Mian, does President Qin still want to support you? Qin Anlin thought for a moment and said, let's see how she performs later. If something like this happens again, fire her immediately. Don't ask me. It didn't matter if King Entertainment had Xiao Mian or not. Jie interjected. When President Qin wanted to promote her, was it for King Entertainment or for President Qin himself? Chapter 1642. Qin Anlin looked at Jie with a warning look, but Jie looked innocent and didn't flinch or get scared. You're becoming less and less afraid of me. Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. Don't get involved with her and plot against me anymore. Jie's expression became a little uncomfortable. She coughed lightly and said, How is this a plot? I was just drinking. Besides, I can't drive even if I'm drunk. Qin Anlin gave her face and didn't say much. However, Jie still asked Qin Anlin, President Qin, you haven't answered the question just now. Qin Anlin looked at her for a long time before he said faintly, That's not important. It's President Qin who hasn't thought about it properly either. Jie smiled faintly. Then President Qin can think about it carefully. He might have a better understanding of Xia Mian's future plans. She left after she finished speaking. Qin Anlin looked at the door thoughtfully. When Jie walked out, she saw that Xia Mian was still there. Her eyes were a little swollen, as if she had been crying. Why are you crying? Jie's voice was very calm. Xia Mian grunted in response. Then, she took Jie's arm and said in a low voice, Jie, can you help me? Jie looked at Xia Mian with a somewhat serious expression. Xia Mian, you're a newcomer to King Entertainment, and President Qin wants to promote you. She paused for a moment and said, Xia Mian, don't forget, you're an employee. You shouldn't have any improper thoughts about President Qin. Xia Mian was stunned. Her lips trembled, and she quickly retorted, but Yu Liangxiu was like this back then. President Qin was single at that time, and President Qin took the initiative to be with them. Jie's tone became more and more serious. Xia Mian, I think if you and President Qin had anything going on, it would greatly affect your career. Do you think Yu Liangxiu would let you off the hook if you and President Qin had anything going on? After all, Xia Mian was still young and aggressive, so she immediately answered, I'm not afraid. The premise of you not being afraid is that President Qin will protect you. Do you think that's possible? Jie gave the final warning. Xia Mian was not convinced. Why isn't it possible? Jie was quite angry. You won't cry until you see the coffin. She paused for a moment. It's better to reflect on yourself at home. With that, Jie walked towards the elevator. Xia Mian was stunned for a moment, then she followed. Jie, Xia Mian called out pitifully. Jie turned her head and said, You're on your own. She was not a soft-hearted person. Xia Mian's thoughts should be destroyed by herself. Otherwise, she would suffer in the future. Xia Mian stood there, watching the elevator open and close. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clenched her fists. Yu Liangxiu, I don't believe that I'm not as good as you, she murmured. She had to shine brightly. She had to be above everyone else and become the real Empress of Heaven. In the top-floor office of the ATV, Linda stood in front of Yu Liangxiu's desk, reporting the situation. Yu Liangxiu looked up. Frozen. I think she can't have any work for a month. Linda smiled. For a young star like Xia Mian, this is killing her. One had to know that King Entertainment could make such a decision at any time and replace Xia Mian with someone else. Yu Liangxiu pursed her lips and said indifferently, so she did it. Linda asked softly, Mr. Yi, what? Chapter 1643. Linda, however, was still worried. What if Xia Mian is really frozen? Then wouldn't all the drama we spent 150 million yuan on go to waste? How could that be? Yu Liangxiu looked down. Don't underestimate this girl. She'll stop before she completely pisses off Qin Anlin, because that was what Xia Mian had always done. But she wondered how Su Shicheng would treat Xia Mian. Would he use his usual tricks? Yu Liangxiu felt that she was quite cold-blooded, but she didn't need to feel guilty. Between her and Xia Mian, one of them would be hurt in the end, and it would be either her or Xia Mian. She wasn't a saint, so Xia Mian was destined to be cannon fodder. Yu Liangxiu flipped through the documents in her hands and said in a low and slow voice, Set the broadcast date for around Christmas. Linda let out an ah to express her confusion. I'll give Qin Anlin 3 months. If Xiao Mian doesn't become popular, then there's no chance for her to do so. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Linda still didn't understand. If Xiao Mian didn't become popular, would the advertisement for the drama still sell? Yi Liangqiu's eyes fell on Linda's face. She didn't say anything, but Linda shivered. Mr. Ye's expression was a bit like Mr. Su's. After ATV announced the schedule of summer solstice and Xiao Mian came to see Yi Liangqiu within 2 days. At first, she came to ATV to ask to see Xiao Mian, but Linda stopped her. Miss Xia, Mr. Yi is in a meeting. I can wait. Xiao Mian's tone was a little reserved. She had recently been named one of the 4 most popular actresses of the new generation, which was also promoted by King Entertainment. Therefore, she thought highly of herself. Linda smiled. I'll go and see if Mr. Yi has time to see you. Linda walked into the meeting room and came out after a while. Sorry, Miss Xia. Mr. Ye's meeting may last until noon. Can you make an appointment another day? Xiao Mian pursed her lips and said unhappily, I'm just going to say a few words. Is she busy? Miss Xia, if you want to see Mr. Yi, you have to make an appointment. Linda was also a little unhappy. What was wrong with this woman? She wasn't even famous yet, and she dared to come and provoke them. She didn't even know where she was. Xiao Mian's voice was cold. Yi Liangqiu deliberately suppressed me. Can't I say a few words? Linda sneered, suppress? Miss Xia, why do you think Mr. Yi needs to suppress you? Why would they suppress you? Because of what happened between me and President Qin. Xiao Mian snorted. Linda cursed in her heart. Did he really think that he was something? About her and President Qin? Just as he was about to mock her, Yi Liangqiu came out. When he looked at Xiao Mian, he paused for a moment, looking a little surprised. And behind her, there were more than 10 senior executives, as if they were stars surrounding the moon. Xiao Mian looked at Linda and said aggressively, Didn't you say that the meeting won't end until noon? It's me who doesn't want to see you. Yi Liangqiu spoke for Linda. She stopped walking, and the people behind her also stopped and looked at Xiao Mian. Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly. Miss Xia, you said that you have something to do with Anlin? Can you tell me what it is? Xiao Mian was embarrassed by her straightforwardness. I really want to know what happened between my husband and another woman, Miss Xia. Yi Liangqiu rolled up the documents in her hand and gently patted her leg, looking relaxed. Chapter 1644. Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Miss Xia, don't you think so? Xiao Mian was embarrassed and embarrassed. A group of people were looking at her as a joke, and their eyes were obviously unkind. Her lips trembled, and she didn't speak. Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Let's talk in my office. After all, it's a private matter. Linda made a gesture and said, Miss Xia, please. After that, she secretly sighed in relief. Mr. Yi was really smart. He knew why Xiao Mian was here, but he didn't say anything. Wouldn't Xiao Mian be anxious? Xiao Mian followed Linda. Yi Liangqiu turned around and said a few words to a few executives before walking into the office. Linda poured a glass of water for Xiao Mian and didn't leave. She stood there like a door god. Yi Liangqiu, I want to talk to you in private. Xiao Mian's voice was a little stiff. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda and then back at Xiao Mian. She said lightly, There's nothing to avoid. Linda is my secretary. Xiao Mian still wanted to say something, but Yi Liangqiu smiled and said, Miss Xia, please make it short. I have something to do later. Xiao Mian pursed her lips and said, What I want to ask is, why did you schedule my film so long before Christmas? Linda poured a cup of tea for Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu took a sip and then looked at Xiao Mian. Did Qin Anlin ask you to come? I asked myself. Xiao Mian's little face was a little tense, and the expression on her face was the stubborn one that Yi Liangqiu was familiar with. Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on her face. After looking at her for a long time, he smiled faintly. Since you're the one who asked, please leave. Why? Xiao Mian was unwilling to give up, so her tone was naturally not good. But she forgot that she was in an ATV. Yi Liangqiu sneered and said, Miss Xia, who do you think you are to question me? Xiao Mian was stunned. After a long while, she said softly, I'm the person President Qin likes. Linda couldn't stand it anymore. She had seen shameless people, but she had never seen such a shameless person. So Linda snorted coldly. President Qin likes you. So why didn't he stand up for you? But you came here yourself. You're so shameless. You're not a joke. Yu Liangqiu stopped her. Linda, show some respect to Miss Xia. After all, she is the person President Qin likes. Linda, on the other hand, stopped moving and stepped back. I got it. Then, she solemnly apologized to Xiao Mian. Miss Xia, I'm sorry. However, in Xiao Mian's ears, these words sounded sarcastic, and she couldn't lose her temper. She was so angry that her face turned red. Yu Liangqiu glanced at Linda and smiled. Xiao Mian was even angrier. Her face turned the color of pig liver. She pursed her lips and said, Mr. Yi, you haven't answered my question. Do you also want to know the internal secrets of ATV, Miss Xia? Yu Liangqiu's tone was very calm, and her eyes fell on Xiao Mian's face. As for the relationship between Miss Xia and Anlin, I don't think it's necessary for you to specifically tell me. Qin Anlin is a married man. Miss Xia, you know better than anyone else. In the future, you should be more respectful of yourself. Xiao Mian was really angry. Yu Liangqiu's words were a slap in the face. The film is mine. I have the right to know why, she said stubbornly. Yu Liangqiu didn't want to argue with her anymore. She said in a displeased and impatient tone, Linda, see our guest out. Linda had never seen such an insensible person. How could she make such a fuss? Chapter 1645. Xiao Mian's eyes widened. No, I'm not done yet. Yu Liangqiu dialed a number. After the call went through, she said faintly, Qin Anlin, your woman, Xiao Mian, is making a scene in my office. Come and take her away. Xiao Mian was shocked. President Qin? Her big watery eyes were wide open, and her face was full of fear. She really looked delicate and pitiful. No! Xiao Mian bit her lip and said in a hoarse voice, Yu Liangqiu, you're so despicable. I'm just helping you. Yu Liangqiu sat up straight. It's up to you whether you want to leave or leave first. Xiao Mian was furious. She bit her lip and said, Yu Liangqiu, you won't have a good ending. Really? Yu Liangqiu looked at her indignant face and smiled. Miss Xia, if you have the ability, you should pray for yourself. Xiao Mian still wanted to say something, but she couldn't gain the upper hand. In the end, she could only leave angrily. As soon as she left, Linda said unhappily, Mr. Yi, you're too kind to her. If it were me, I would have asked the security guards to drive her away. Yu Liangqiu smiled faintly. There's no need for that. Xiao Mian is too weak right now. Did you really call President Qin just now? Linda laughed. Xiao Mian was obviously lying. If there was something going on between her and President Qin, she wouldn't have come here herself. She's so stupid. Yu Liangqiu smiled. No way, she paused for a moment. You just called 10086. Linda was stunned at first, but then she laughed. That's great. I don't think she'll dare to come here again. We'll have plenty of opportunities to meet in the future. Yu Qiuqiu looked down. Just wait and see. Xiao Mian won't be so easy to get rid of. Indeed, Xiao Mian understood when she went downstairs. She had been tricked by Yu Liangqiu. However, Xiao Mian didn't dare to go up again. She stayed there for a month and begged Ing Jie for help. Although Ing Jie didn't like her, Ing Jie was a fair manager. King Entertainment had invested a lot in Xiao Mian, so it would be unrealistic and capricious to let her go so easily. Whether or not she could become famous depended on Xiao Mian's luck. Xiao Mian worked even harder and didn't dare to act rashly anymore. When she overestimated herself and hit her head against the wall, she finally understood what it meant to wait for the right opportunity to strike. She already had some fame to begin with. In addition, she had appeared on a certain large-scale reality show, which gave her a very good image. She was the national goddess, so she seemed to have become popular all of a sudden. In a short period of time, she became a popular celebrity. She appeared on the news from time to time in various airport shows. Her hype was quite successful. Later on, during a fashion week, she outshone a popular celebrity and was in the limelight. Yi Lianxiu put down the magazine in her hand and looked at Linda. How's the advertising for summer solstice, Xiaomian, coming along? We haven't decided on the title sponsorship yet, but we've decided on the other commercials. Mr. Yi will be satisfied with the price. Linda smiled. Not only was this a tangible benefit, but it was also more than that for the ATV. Yi Lianxiu nodded. Give it to that comfort bow sanitary pad. Linda froze for a moment, then understood. She held back her laughter. Okay, I'll arrange for the contract to be signed. President, you must have done it on purpose. In that commercial, Xiaomian was indeed seductive in her panties. It was good, and it would help the ratings as well. Chapter 1646. She reached out to look at the calendar and sighed. It's almost Christmas. Tonight is Christmas Eve. It was almost New Year's again. She was most afraid of New Year's. If Silent wasn't by her side, it might be more difficult for her, but with Silent around, she felt uneasy. Linda echoed, Yeah, we're so busy at the end of the year. We have all kinds of parties, New Year's Eve, and we're all busy. Linda cheered up a little. ATV's situation turned around so much in the second half of the year, we should celebrate. Yi Lianxiu smiled. Invite Xiaomian over for New Year's Eve. You can pay her as you see fit. Linda nodded. Got it. Invite her if she's suitable, but don't force her if she's not suitable, Yi Lianxiu added. Linda was a little confused, and Yi Lianxiu didn't say much. After work, she didn't go back directly because she had a social engagement that night. It was very busy at New Year's Eve. In addition to ATV's business, she also had to deal with people. Linda booked a private room at the GM Hotel and invited the CEOs of several important brands. The CEO of a sanitary pad company was also there, and he could be considered ATV's biggest financial backer. At night, the lights were just turned on, and the private room was quite lively. Naturally, drinking was inevitable. President Su of the sanitary pad company was in high spirits. He raised his glass and toasted. Mr. Yi, I heard from my secretary that ATV hasn't decided on a sponsorship for New Year's Eve yet. Mr. Yi, do you have a crush on me? As soon as he said this, everyone around him laughed, and the laughter was somewhat ambiguous. President Su, you're really good at talking. Come, let's have a drink first. Later, you and Mr. Yi will have a toast to liven up the atmosphere. He popped out of nowhere and toasted Chairman Su. Men were most interested in this kind of topic. Once the atmosphere was livened up, they became even more interested, especially for a beauty like Director Yi. One must know how difficult it was to invite Heavenly Queen Yi Lianxiu to a meal back in the day. Even if he tried to flatter her, he wouldn't even get to see her face. Now that Yi Lianxiu had become the boss of ATV, everyone was able to get closer to each other, so they were a little carried away for a while. This was something he couldn't have imagined back then. Linda couldn't sit still when these people were making a ruckus. This was too improper. Besides, CEO Yi had a husband now. What was the point of drinking with them? However, Linda knew the big picture. She couldn't afford to offend any of them. Thus, she stood up and smiled sweetly. Then I'll drink with all the CEOs. It won't be a problem, even if we drink one by one. Chairman Su chuckled. Our Linda is quite ambitious. But can she handle so many men? His words were a little ambiguous, almost obscene. Linda's expression didn't change. She bashfully clinked her glass. That's why all of you have to be kind to the fairer sex. She used to follow Su Shicheng, and this kind of thing was not rare, so it was not a big deal. Linda was willing to sacrifice herself, but Yi Lianxiu wouldn't sit back and do nothing. She stood up and smiled faintly. There's no need to drink with each other. All of you have families, so it's not convenient. She had a dignified aura about her. Others would still give her face, but when they thought of the tigress at home, they would be a lot more timid. However, Chairman Su smiled. I've just regained my single status. The atmosphere froze. Forget about Linda. Mr. Yi, how about a drink? Chairman Su walked over and personally poured a glass for Yi Lianxiu. I'm already here. Mr. Yi won't disappoint me, right? Chapter 1647. When President Su heard that voice, his body froze, and he almost peed his pants. He turned around slowly and saw Qin Amlin standing at the entrance of the private room with a terrible expression. President Su's hand trembled as he held his wine glass, and he almost spilled the wine. His expression was a little unnatural. President Qin. Qin Amlin nodded and walked in with Kime behind him. Kime looked at Yu Liangxiu worriedly. Qin Amlin walked over to President Su and smiled faintly. President Su, if you want to have a drink with me, I'm more than happy to oblige. The muscles on President Su's face twitched unnaturally. After a while, he squeezed out a smile. President Qin, I don't think that's a good idea. There is no need for two men to have a drink with each other. Qin Amlin put on a fake smile. Isn't it a good idea? He turned sideways to look at Yi Liangxiu. Then, he wrapped his arm around her and held her in his arms. This sudden display of affection stunned everyone. Qin Amlin and Yu Liangxiu were enemies. Even though they had been together for a while a few months ago, they didn't have much interaction after that. Hence, most of them thought that it was just groundless accusations. But now, it seemed like President Qin was still quite concerned about Mr. Yi. Everyone present couldn't help but worry. Were they being too rash just now? Qin Amlin smiled faintly and looked at Yi Liangxiu. Then, his gaze landed on President Su's face. It's more inappropriate for my wife to drink with President Su, isn't it? President Su was startled and sobered up. His back was covered in cold sweat as he said, I drank too much. I deserve to be punished. I hope that President Qin and Mr. Yi won't be offended if I offended you. Everyone looked on. Under Qin Amlin's cold gaze, President Su downed 5 glasses in one go. When he downed the last glass, he ran outside and vomited. Throughout the entire process, no one spoke, and the entire private room was silent. Qin Amlin tilted his head and looked at Yu Liangxiu with an indifferent expression. Aren't you going back yet? I have business to talk about. She gently broke away from him, ungrateful. Qin Amlin glanced around. The CEOs all said that it was Christmas Eve and they had to go home to accompany their wives and children. In an instant, only the two of them, Kime and Linda, were left in the room. Kime smiled and said, Linda, let me send you back. Linda understood. I'm alone. Let's go for a drink. Kime smiled. She agreed to it. Although they each had their own masters, tonight was a lonely night, so they might as well be companions. The private room was empty, and the male and female leads were staring at each other. Is this how you talk to people about business? Qin Amlin picked up the wine on her table and took a sip. Very good, it was white. When he looked at her, his gaze was a little sharp. Tell me, do you give yourself to these people when you're drunk? Yu Liangxiu's gaze was indifferent. She smiled. Who is President Qin to restrict me? He stared at her and didn't speak. Yu Liangxiu smiled. Husband and wife? I don't dare to think that President Qin and I still have feelings for each other. If her deliberate seduction last time was a test, then in the past few months he had truly been ruthless, and his attacks on ATV had never stopped. Now, she even thought that he sent Xia Mian's drama to ATV to disgust her. Qin Amlin's gaze was deep. Feelings or not, we are still husband and wife. I don't want my reputation to be ruined because of Mr. Yi. Chapter 1648. He was a little annoyed and his voice was stern. Yi Liangxiu, President Qin, you're too excited. This is not good. She smiled lightly and put her beautiful and slender fingers against her forehead. Compared to his tension, she was relaxed and even a little lazy. Probably because she had drunk some wine, her whole little face was dyed with a beautiful layer of crimson. Beautiful and hateful. Qin Amlin narrowed his eyes and suddenly pulled her in front of him. She bumped into his body, which was unbelievably hard. She took the opportunity to lie on his shoulder and put her hands around his neck. Amlin, I want to see Mu Yun and Mu Mu. Her body was soft and hot. When she was lying on his shoulder and talking, the hot breath sprayed on the side of his neck intentionally or unintentionally. Qin Amlin reluctantly admitted that he had been flirted with. He was annoyed, but there was nothing he could do. His hand was on her waist, and his voice was a little warm. "Go back with me tonight, and you'll be able to see them." His words were very secretive, but she understood. Going back with him meant that he wanted her. This was an exchange. He didn't say it out loud, but they both knew it. Yu Liangxiu tightened her fingers and put them around his neck. She was a little drunk. "Okay." After a while, she bit his neck again. "We'll go back after we've done it in the hotel." Qin Anlin had only said it out of anger, but he didn't expect that she would agree. For a moment, he was a little stunned. However, he quickly reacted. He held her hand and walked towards the door of the private room. He quickly walked through the aisle and into the lobby. When the receptionist saw him, she smiled and handed the door card to him. "President Qin, this is what our little boss Pei prepared for you." Pei Chi again. Qin Anlin's eyebrows twitched, and he had a headache. Why did he feel that Pei Chi was doing it now? At this time, he had a feeling that he was being watched. Not only that, but the receptionist specially said, "We have a box of Tsunomoto Platinum in the suite. President Qin, have a pleasant evening." Yu Liangxiu leaned on his shoulder and laughed, with her head tilted to one side. "How many do you want tonight?" Looking at the stains on his neck, she knew that he had been living like a monk for the past few months. She was so hateful. Qin Anlin angrily slapped her waist and dragged her away. The receptionist whispered to each other, "It's the one who used 9 condoms last night." His voice was just loud enough for Qin Anlin to hear. His face darkened, but Yu Liangxiu smiled even more happily. "Do you want to go to another restaurant?" He was already very anxious. It was not easy to get rid of a man who had been alone for nearly 4 months. No matter how hateful she was, once she entered the room, she would be pushed against the door and kissed by him fiercely. She trembled again and again, but he didn't let her go. He was as fierce as a primitive beast. After an unknown amount of time, when he let go of her, Yu Liangxiu felt that her legs were no longer her own, and a layer of skin seemed to have been rubbed off on her back. If she thought that it could end like this, then she was too naive. In short, he used up the box of Tsunomoto Platinum until 2 o'clock in the night. However, after venting his body, his spirit was empty. He turned his head to look at her. She was not asleep, just lying on her side. Chapter 1649. Not only did she not resist, but she was also very cooperative. Of course, he was also satisfied with her body because he could feel that she did not have anyone else before him. Her reaction couldn't be deceived. Both of them were satisfied, but they were too proud to say it. Yu Liangxiu sat up slowly and smiled. "Both." He looked at her and said calmly after a while, "Go take a shower." She did not move. "Didn't you say you wanted to see the child?" He squinted his eyes and took a long puff of his cigarette before putting it out. However, just as he was about to get up, she hugged him and buried her face in his chest. "Anlin, I can't walk anymore." His body stiffened. After a long time, he asked, "What's wrong?" "My leg hurts." She leaned into his embrace and said in a low voice. Qin Anlin's body stiffened even more. He adjusted the lights and checked. Indeed, it was an injury. At this moment, he remembered how rough and careless he had been before. He remembered that she had cried and said no, but he still pressed her down and did it to his heart's content. "I'll help you apply the ointment." His voice was slightly hoarse. It seemed that every time they did it, he would hurt her. Qin Anlin's ointment was sent by the receptionist. The receptionist made a mental note to prepare medicine for President Qin's external injuries in the future. Qin Anlin carefully applied the ointment for Yu Liangxiu. Then, he remembered that she had not taken a shower. He paused for a moment before carrying her to wash up and apply the ointment once more. After all, he had not been in contact with her for a long time. Even though he was applying the ointment, he still looked carefully. As he looked, his eyes seemed to be on fire. Yu Liangxiu lay on the bed and turned her face away uncomfortably. He looked at her and finally felt that he could not bear to see her walking back and forth. He got up and put on his clothes. "I'll bring the child over." She was surprised that he was so easy to talk to. Qin Anlin left quickly. She lay on the bed and fell asleep. Her pillow was filled with his scent. Tonight was Christmas Eve. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth as she slowly fell asleep. When she woke up in a daze, it was about an hour later. She felt a warm little thing in her arms, and two little hands were grabbing at something. She woke up gently. Under the dim yellow light, a chubby little fellow was nestled in her arms. Its little hands were busy, as if it was looking for something. The little fellow couldn't find it and was extremely anxious. At this moment, her father began to act. His large palms nimbly helped her untie it, and then he threw Lil Fatty into her arms. The little girl's natural instinct made her eat like this, but Yu Liangxiu didn't eat anything. Although she didn't eat anything, little Moo Moo still enjoyed it. As her father, he was also very interested. He had imagined that scene many times, and one day, it finally came true. His wife and daughter were sleeping beside him. No matter how many grievances he had, he could only put them aside. Qin Anlin lay quietly beside her and looked down at her gentle expression. Then, he looked at little Moo Moo in her arms. This child is not bad compared to Xiaoxin. He's also chubby. In the middle of the night, his voice was also extremely seductive. Especially at this time, it was so gentle that it made her feel like crying. More than once, she thought that tonight was Christmas Eve. He was actually willing. "Where's Mu Yin?" She sniffled, raised her eyes, and pretended that nothing had happened. Chapter 1650. What he meant was that boys could be independent, and little Moo Moo could sleep with his parents. Yu Liangxiu was surprised. "Momo is here, too." "Yes." His voice was indifferent. "I'll pick him up." Yu Liangxiu didn't say anything for a long time. Qin Anlin said softly, "Su Shiqing isn't here, is he?" She didn't hide it from him. "Most of them aren't here, but they come back occasionally." He snorted and didn't say anything. After a while, he suddenly looked at her with a burning gaze. "Why did Su Shiqing allow you to sleep with me?" Her heart skipped a beat. He stared at her and didn't miss the slightest expression on her face. She didn't say anything, so he said self-deprecatingly, "You want to use a honey trap, don't you?" Yu Liangxiu looked at little Moo Moo in her arms and couldn't look away. That soft and tender little guy was so cute and soft that her heart could melt at any time. "Not tonight." She looked up at him. "Anlin, it's just that I miss you guys tonight." She said, "You guys." His heart twitched, and there was an indescribable feeling in his heart. Perhaps he could only let go of his hatred on this Christmas Eve. Yes, since they were together, he should let go of it. He didn't care about her purpose, as long as he enjoyed it peacefully. She looked at the little guy in her arms tenderly, and he looked at her too. At this moment, time was quiet. He lifted the quilt and got out of bed. Under her surprised gaze, he walked to the bedroom door. Yu Liangxiu called out to him softly, "Anlin." Her voice was naturally affectionate, just like when they were together in the past. He turned around and saw that the soft little guy was still in her arms. She was half propping herself up, and she looked indescribably charming. She looked at him, and so did he. Their eyes met in the middle of the night. "Where are you going?" she asked a little awkwardly. Qin Anlin lowered his eyes. "I'm going to make some supper." She leaned against the bed, and her long eyelashes fluttered, as if she didn't believe him. His gaze lingered on her face for a long time before he finally left. Yu Liangxiu buried her face in little Moo Moo's little body. Smelling the fragrance of the little guy, she said softly, "Daddy still likes Mommy, don't you?" Little Moo Moo naturally couldn't speak. He could only make noises. The little fellow was woken up in the middle of the night. She had not eaten anything for a long time, so her temper flared up. Her little face wrinkled, and she began to cry. Fortunately, her voice wasn't loud, but she still needed to be coaxed. She had given birth to 3 children, so she naturally knew how to coax them. Thus, she buttoned up her clothes and carried the little fellow to the small kitchen. Qin Anlin was still making supper. There was ready-made food in the fridge, and he only needed to fry it. Yu Liangxiu stood at the door with the baby in her arms and looked at him. Qin Anlin was dressed in black trousers and a white sweater. He stood cleanly and skillfully. There was a peace in his eyes that had not been seen for a long time. As she looked at it, she felt nostalgic and actually forgot about little Moo Moo in her arms. Why are you up? Isn't your leg hurting? He was still looking at the golden cake in the pot. He didn't even raise his head as he asked lightly. Yuliancio was shocked. Only then did she wake up from her dream and look at the little guy in her arms. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.